Hello, I'm Megan Lazovic, Vice President from Edison Research.
And I'm Lamar Johnson, VP of Sponsorship Marketing at NPR. And today we'll be presenting the Spoken Word Audio Report from NPR and Edison Research.
Please feel free to ask questions throughout this presentation in the Q&A box. We have people standing by to help. Or if you are watching the replay of this webinar, email info@edisonresearch.com with your questions.
We encourage you to share what you learned today on social media. And if you do, please use the hashtag #SpokenWordAudio. After this webinar, the full report will be available to download at npr.org/spokenwordaudio. And that site will also give you access to reports and videos from our previously published studies.
I can't believe that this is the 4th edition of the Spoken Word Audio Report. Over the years, we've shared a lot about how important spoken word audio is to listeners. But it occurred to me that we haven't shared much of our experiences with spoken word. While I was in college, I was lucky enough to score a job at a local talk radio station. I was a call screener for Passion Phones, an evening call-in show. While my peers were out at parties, I would be in the studio, chatting with callers and queuing them up to go on the air. In between screening out potential Baba Booies, I was able to observe firsthand the people who loved spoken word audio. The connections these listeners have with the hosts and the stations are so strong. And through my work in consumer research, including the past 4 years researching spoken word audio with NPR, I can confirm that the relationship between content makers and listeners remains today, even as the audio space has evolved with more spoken word content available on demand. Digital platforms have opened up new ways for people to listen to and connect. Lamar, I imagine with your experience at NPR, you've had some similar observations.
You know, at NPR, we talk a lot about the intimacy of audio. Our hosts are a part of the audience's lives, from making coffee in the morning with our daily news podcast, Up First, to that driveway moment at the end of the day when you just can't get enough and can't get out of your car until you hear the end of an all things considered story. We hear from audiences that NPR is an important, essential part of their everyday lives. So thank you for letting us indulge ourselves a little bit before we get deep into the data about our favorite medium.
The Spoken Word Audio Report pulls from Edison Research's Share of Ear, a quarterly report where we ask a nationally representative sample of Americans to keep a detailed one-day diary of their audio usage. We've been conducting Share of Ear since 2014, so we are able to observe the growth in spoken word audio over that time. With a substantial sample of over 4,000 people who are age 13 and older from the US, we're able to slice and dice the data in a ton of different ways. This is especially helpful in examining the habits of younger listeners, which will be a big focus of today. And let's clarify upfront what we mean by spoken word audio for this report. Here's a little more about what we're measuring with the Share of Ear study. This diary study asks panelists to record their listening to any type of audio. That could be music, news, sports, talk and personalities, or audiobooks. For the purposes of this report, anything that is not music is classified as spoken word audio.
While we'll share a lot of findings with you today, there are 3 things we'd like you to remember when we finish today. We've reported on the growth in this space in previous reports, and we're excited to share it with you again. Time spent with spoken word audio is increasing. Incredibly, spoken word's share of audio listening has increased by 45% over the last 8 years.
And this report will have a special focus on young listeners. Younger listeners' time spent listening to spoken word has increased by 214% over the last 8 years. And there is incredible potential with increased listening as more and more Gen Zs are discovering spoken word audio.
And finally, something we're excited to report for the first time ever. Among daily spoken word audio listeners, a majority of their time with audio now goes to spoken word. The main story here is that we're seeing growth in a medium that was already big in the lives of listeners.
So let's get into the data. We'll start by demonstrating how the number of people listening to spoken word audio is increasing. 46% of the US population listen to at least some spoken word audio every day, according to our listening study. That's up from our report in 2021, when 45% listened daily and 43% listened in 2020.
That's pretty close to a majority of people listening to spoken word audio every day. For brands and advertisers, this is a clear indicator that audio is an impactful addition to any media strategy. And spoken word in particular offers a highly engaged audience that produces a higher ROI. The number of spoken word listeners has grown pretty steadily over time, and overall, in just 8 years, there are an estimated 26 million more people listening to spoken word audio in the US. That is incredible growth. There are an estimated 131 million daily spoken word audio listeners in the US today, up from 105 million daily listeners as reported in 2014.
And is that listening happening mostly during peak points of the day? We're able to look at our audio diaries to see when exactly people are turning to spoken word. And it turns out that it has increased in many day parts. We'll start back in 2014. The orange portion of this graph represents that percent of those in the US who were listening to spoken word in each hour. Or if you're familiar with the terms, this would be the cume or reach of spoken word. We see back in 2014, the greatest number of people listened to spoken word audio around the 7 a.m. hour. That's when about 12% of those in the US aged 13 and older are listening to spoken word. There is a smaller peak in the afternoon drive time around 5 p.m. Now let's look at 2019, the dark blue pictured here. The peaks and valleys are nearly the same, but the top line is a little more rounded. What accounts for that? Well, it seems people are shifting the times of days they were listening a bit, most likely due to the rising popularity of on-demand digital content. And while 2019 was only 3 years ago, it somehow feels like an eternity ago. That was the last normal year before the pandemic. Of course, much has changed in the daily lives of people due to COVID. Many people started working from home, and while that was only temporary for some, it helped accelerate trends such as shifted work hours and remote work. How do you think all these changes will translate into spoken word listening? Well, here we see the light blue data populate the screen, and there seems to be a lot more space occupied by it. Reach has increased in almost every single hour, and those peaks have been rounded out even more. We still see more listening in the morning and evening drive times, but those high numbers are sustained in more places throughout the day as well. Again, this is thanks in part to the increase in digital content, and perhaps a testament to all the amazing content that is available today that keeps people happy and listening.
So naturally, if listening grew in pretty much every hour, overall time spent with spoken word audio has increased, and spoken word's share of listening has grown as well. In 2014, 20% of the time spent with any type of audio went to spoken word audio. 80% of time with audio went to listening to music. But look at how the time is divided in more recent years. The share of time spent with spoken word has risen consistently and is currently 29% of all audio listening time. If we factor the percent change since 2014, we can say that spoken word's share of audio listening has increased by 45% over the last 7 years. This is really great to see. NPR has been pushing this needle forward for decades, so we're thrilled that audio continues to carve out space in listeners' daily lives.
And we promised a special focus today on younger listeners. That's because they are driving a lot of growth of share in the time with spoken word. In this graph, we see total population represented on the left. There's a jump from a 20% share in 2014 to 29%. That's our 45% increase. But those ages 13 to 34 have the largest gain since 2014. Back then, spoken word was only 12% for those ages 13 to 34 in 2014, and it has grown to 26% of their time today. That's 117% growth in share for spoken word among those age 13 to 34 in the past 8 years. There are increases in other ages as well, a 36% jump among those age 35 to 54-year-olds, and a 23% increase among those 55 and older. But I want to dig into that younger age group a bit more. After all, one of the most requested topics in research these days centers on Gen Z, those in the younger half of this crosstab we see on the page. Those aged 13 to 24, our Gen Zs, are listening a lot more compared to their age counterparts from almost a decade ago. This age group has gone from 7% of listening in 2014 to 22% in 2022. That's more than double, a 214% increase in time spent listening to spoken word audio. Another change in the world of spoken word audio is the ways that people are accessing the content. Trends show that spoken word audio listening is constantly shifting digital. Back in 2014, 73% of spoken word audio was listened to through a traditional AM/FM radio receiver. Listening to spoken word on digital devices was a much smaller portion than it is today. You can see time with the analog devices decrease over time. While we do see the introduction of things like smart speakers and internet-connected TVs contribute to a little bit of the shift to digital, the device with the most growth is the item that is small enough to fit in your pocket, the mobile device.
Mobile had a 9% share of time with spoken word audio back in 2014 and has steadily grown to 34% today. Let's calculate that percent increase, shall we? The share of spoken word listening that happens on a mobile device has increased by 278% over the last 8 years. At NPR, we've seen this growth in our total digital audience as well, both listening online and NPR.org digital usage, which actually surpassed the NPR broadcast audience a couple of years ago. And there's growth across age cohorts. But what I want to point out here is those aged 13 to 24. About a decade ago, this age group was less likely than older groups to own a smartphone. However, today, they are more likely to own one. In 2014, those 13 to 24 were also spending less time listening to spoken word on a mobile device. 15% of their time went to spoken word on a mobile device versus 62% today.
Now, we know that Gen Z has a special relationship with their phones. Recently, in partnership with PRPD, Edison Research conducted in-depth interviews with those age 14 to 24 to learn about the media behaviors of Gen Z. Here's a glimpse at those conversations.
So let's say when I wake up, like I get on my phone in the morning.
Well, immediately when I wake up, I probably go on like Instagram or Snapchat to scroll through, see what's going on over the time I was asleep.
I usually check Snapchat first, just to see if anyone's texted me at all.
Okay, so I wake up. I watch TikTok until I have to get up. And then normally when I'm getting ready, I will listen to a podcast. It's normally a news podcast.
When I eat breakfast, when I am talking to my family, I try to be engaged, and then so I'll flip my phone over. But after everyone's gone, I'll probably go on my phone. I'll probably scroll on TikTok.
Once I'm ready, I usually go to breakfast at the dining hall. So I listen to music on Spotify as I walk there. And then if the line is long, I usually go on Facebook and just kind of scroll.
Sometimes I'll listen to music in the morning. I'll often listen to music or a podcast on my commute to work.
Anytime really I'm in the car, Apple Music is being used. Sometimes I'll use the podcast app and I'll listen to a podcast.
During school, you're not allowed to have a phone. Although lunch, I am on my phone.
Lunch or whatever, and then go and watch YouTube videos on hair tutorials and stuff, makeup tutorials too.
During lunch, I usually watch a little TikTok.
When I wake up from my afternoon nap, that sounds like I'm a toddler, but when I wake up from my afternoon nap, normally that's when I like go back on TikTok. And sometimes that can turn into a few hours of TikTok.
When I get home, I'm probably gonna scroll on TikTok. I might play a video game. The video game is probably gonna be Animal Crossing because it's very relaxing.
At night, we usually, as a family, will watch some TV shows. We use Disney Plus a lot. We love our Disney shows. Marvel's really awesome.
Normally we'll watch like an episode of some form of media before going to bed.
Sometimes I'll watch TV on like the big TV, but a lot of times it's like I like to watch TV on my laptop. Like I'll watch Grey's Anatomy. I'm a big fan of Grey's Anatomy, but only the older seasons.
I usually watch way too much TikTok at night. It kind of sucks you in a little bit. And then I go to sleep.
When I get home at 11, it's like until I pass out with the phone on my chest. I am like on my phone, Google searching, looking at Facebook, looking at videos or anything I didn't get a chance to look at earlier in the day.
For these young people, their day centers around their phones. If you want your content to find them, it needs to exist there. But the good news is, because they are so connected to their phones, there are plenty of ways to reach them through social media, podcasts, and other forms of digital media. And I'm sure you've already heard plenty of things about TikTok, so I hope everyone watching this today has some form of TikTok strategy.
Certain platforms are benefiting from the shift to digital, especially podcasts. In 2022, podcast listening hit an all-time high. The Infinite Dial from Edison Research, Wondery, and Art19 tracks listening every year. This year, we learned that 62% of the US population has listened to a podcast. When this study was first conducted in 2014, only 30% of those in the US had listened to a podcast. That's quite a jump from 30 to 62% in just 8 years. And we see impressive jumps across all age categories. And amazingly, Gen Z is more likely than the other demos seen on this page to have listened to a podcast. 78% of people aged 13 to 24 have listened to a podcast today, compared to just 37% back in 2014.
And what about the amount of time that people spend with podcasts compared to other sources of spoken word audio? Well, Share of Ear has tracked that too. In 2014, 79% of time spent listening to spoken word audio was with AM/FM radio, and 8% of time was spent with podcasts. 13% of time was with other platforms, such as streaming audio, SiriusXM radio, or audiobooks. The portion of spoken word that comes from AM/FM radio, which might include talk radio, news, sports talk and play-by-play, radio morning shows, and other forums, went from 79% of all spoken word audio in 2014 to 55% in 2019. 2021 was the first year we saw it dip below the majority of time, and as of 2022, 47% of time spent with spoken word audio is from AM/FM radio. Now let's focus on podcasts. I'll point out again that in 2014, 8% of the time spent with spoken word audio was from podcast listening. It jumped to double-digit share in 2015, then a large jump in 2017 to 15% share, and today 22% of all time spent listening to spoken word audio goes to podcasts.
So over time, we see the share of time spent with spoken word audio via podcasts has grown from 8% to 21% of listening. That's an incredible amount of growth. Podcasts' share of time with spoken word audio has increased by 163% over the last 8 years. And we've seen some of the benefits of the growth in this space. In fact, 31% of the time spent listening to podcasts is with NPR or other players in the public radio space. Some of our most popular titles are Up First, NPR News Now, and Planet Money, all of which are available daily.
We can also look at the platform distribution among age groups. And amazingly, look at how much more time is spent with podcasts among Gen Z. That green bar is extra wide for those aged 13 to 24. 39% of their time with spoken word audio is through podcasts, whereas the majority of time among those 35 and older is spent with AM/FM radio. We are also lucky to have access to an incredible study that can give us an idea of the type of podcasts these different age groups are consuming. Edison Podcast Metrics is a survey of weekly podcast listeners. In this study, participants are asked to list every podcast they have been listening to in the past week. They are encouraged to look back at their history across all devices and platforms to provide us with an accurate record of their listening. Edison then codes every single unaided response. And here we see the results coded by genre, which is based on Apple's API. On the left, we see responses among weekly podcast listeners who are age 18 to 24. These are the top genres coded among this younger group. Comedy is way out front. 62% reported listening to a comedy podcast in the last week. Society and culture is second on the list, followed by true crime. News makes the fourth spot, and sports and education are tied at fifth place. Now let's look at those aged 25 and older on the right. Comedy is still on top, only it has less of a huge lead at 39%. News is second among this group at 31%. Society and culture is number 3, followed by true crime. And finally, sports and business are tied for 5th. So most of the items on these two lists are the same. However, news gets a more prominent place among the older group, and business replaces education for the older group as well. Certainly, it makes sense that as one ages, they are more interested in news and current events, right, Lamar?
Absolutely. This shift is consistent with research we did a few years ago to understand the audience's journey to NPR, and we found that the peak time of adoption tended to be in the 20s. Listeners talked about coming to NPR at that time in their life because they wanted to be more informed about what's going on in the world, wanted to be a more engaged citizen, and wanted to be able to talk intelligently with friends and colleagues about the current issues of the day. And while we're on the topic of topics, let's dig into the type of spoken word content that people are listening to. Here's the breakdown of the time spent with each type of spoken word among our diary respondents. And we'll show trending back from 2016, where news and information accounted for 41% of time, personalities and talk were a close second at 40% of time, sports was 14%, and audiobooks accounted for the smallest amount of time at 5% of spoken word. These percentages haven't fluctuated much since then. However, audiobooks have grown in share just a bit. Since 2016, audiobooks grew to where it is today at 11%.
Here's share of content type by age. And this is really interesting. Gen Z are very different than older generations. They spend more time with personalities and talk and less time with news. That makes sense, especially after seeing similar trends in the podcast genre data earlier today. They are high on audiobooks as well. We do know that audiobooks have been increasingly used in educational settings more recently. And look at those aged 25 to 34. They look a bit more similar to the older generations than they do the younger subset of listeners, spending more time with news than with personalities. However, they are spending a lot of time with audiobooks, 19% of their spoken word audio time. This would be a great area to research in future studies. Why are audiobooks more popular with younger generations? Certainly, they are often used as an enhancement in education, and of course, they are a great resource for information and entertainment.
Let's narrow our focus a little more. Instead of looking at all time with spoken word audio, here we look at just the time spent listening to talk and personalities. In 2014, 74% of the time spent listening to talk and personalities was through AM/FM radio. 12% of time listening to personalities was through podcasts. And the picture is completely different in 2022. Today, 39% of time listening to personalities is through AM/FM radio. And time listening to personalities on podcasts has had tremendous gains. It's jumped from 12% in 2014 to 41% in 2022.
Now we'll look at the time with news and information across different sources. In 2014, 81% of time spent listening to news and information was through AM/FM radio, and 8% of that time listening to news and info was through podcasts. Fast forward to 2022, and look how different news consumption is. 62% of time listening to news is through AM/FM radio. That's still the majority of time with news through radio. However, people are finding news via other sources as well, including podcasts, streaming audio, SiriusXM, and others.
In fact, 58% of the time spent listening to news is with NPR and public radio. NPR's Morning Edition and All Things Considered have the largest drive time news radio audiences, and our most popular podcast titles are news, Up First and NPR News Now.
And there's one more category of content to look at here, sports audio. In 2014, 86% of time with sports talk was through AM/FM radio. That's now 63% of time. AM/FM is still the predominant source for sports talk. Sports talk is very popular on AM/FM and is especially good for live commentary and play-by-play content.
There are just so many angles to look at this data. And we have one last approach before we finish up today. Because it turns out the listening habits of daily spoken word audio listeners are much different than the habits of the total population. Daily spoken word audio listeners are spending a lot more time with spoken word audio than the general population. The average amount of time spent with spoken word audio among the total population is 1 hour and 4 minutes. But spoken word audio listeners are listening to about double that. They listen to an average of 2 hours and 19 minutes.
And here's the share of spoken word and music among the US population versus daily spoken word audio listeners. You saw these numbers before. Among those aged 13 and older, 29% of their time is spent with spoken word audio. Now, that's a huge percentage, especially given how much growth we've seen over the past 8 years. But still, when it comes to the general population, more audio time is spent with music. Now, let's look at the daily spoken word audio listeners. Their day with audio looks so different. Just under half of their time with audio is music listening, and just over half of their time is spent with spoken word audio. Now, this is just amazing because after all these years of tracking these behaviors, this is the first time we have ever recorded such a high percentage of time with spoken word audio among this group. And that's a major headline for this webinar. Daily spoken word audio listeners spend more audio time with spoken word than with music.
Let's see where we were back in 2014. Back then, among daily spoken word audio listeners, 43% of time with audio was with spoken word. 57% of time with audio among this group went to music. And as we just established in the previous slides, today the split is 51% spoken word versus 49% music. And when we look at this by age, we see that the younger generation of daily spoken word audio listeners are also spending substantial portions of their audio time with spoken word audio. Not as much as those 35 and older, but still an impressive amount of time with speech-based content. Those aged 13 to 24 spend 41% of their audio time with spoken word, and those aged 25 to 34 are a few points higher at 43% of time with spoken word. It's encouraging to see spoken word already taking up so much of this audience's time. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen that audiences tend to age into consuming more news, generally and NPR specifically. So it's great that younger audiences are already seeing the value of spoken word audio, and they are likely to broaden their consumption over time.
So far, we've talked about the increase in spoken word listening, the number of people have increased, the amount of listening throughout the day has increased, and the time people spend listening to spoken word audio has increased. And with that, there are so many exciting stories to tell. Every year, we take a look at spoken word audio's share, and every year we are amazed to see it tick up yet again. We'll continue measuring it, so please keep checking in with us for the latest in this audio category. In the meantime, let's hold on to some of the key findings we've learned today.
First, spoken word's share of audio listening has increased by 45% over the last 8 years.
Younger listeners' time spent listening to spoken word has increased by 214% over the last 8 years. And there is incredible potential with increased listening as more and more Gen Zs are discovering spoken word audio.
And finally, those who already listen to spoken word audio daily listen to an incredible amount. Among daily spoken word audio listeners, a majority of their time with audio now goes to spoken word.
We'll stick around and answer questions in the chat box for the next few minutes, or you may reach us at info@edisonresearch.com if you have questions.
And again, please visit npr.org/spoken word audio for previous, current, and future spoken word audio reports. The slides you saw today are available on the site.
Thanks to everyone who helped prepare this report and webinar, and special thanks to you for joining us today. Thanks again. Goodbye.